I'm a Montrealer, and I grew up in Westmount, which is a suburb of Montreal, of course. And my education I finished in Westmount High School, and then I went to work for the Montreal Star as a junior, of course. And I worked 3 years for the Montreal Star up until the time of my enlistment. And then when I came home from overseas, I went back to work for them for a short time. I was 18, turned 19, but I was in the Reserve Army. I enlisted in March 1939. It was more for the glamour, I think, than anything else, because I joined the Canadian Grenadier Guards, and many things attracted to me. And then when the King and Queen, that was King George VI, came to Montreal, and then he went to Ottawa, we went with him as a guard of honor and trooping the colors on Parliament Hill. And so there was a certain amount of glamour attached to it. And then when the war came along, of course, in September 1939, being in the reserve, I figured that's for me, sort of deal, being young and not probably knowing any better. And I learned that the Canadian Grenadier Guards were not going to be going over for another 2 or 3 years. And I figured, well, the war will be over, I got to get there before it's over. So I changed, and I went down to the recruiting station and learned that there was a medical corps unit going over probably midsummer. So I transferred to the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps on the condition that when I got overseas, they would allow me to transfer back into whatever regiment was my choice. But that didn't happen, and so I wasted, I call waste anyways, 2 years in England until finally I got my transfer into the Royal Canadian Artillery. Father and an uncle was in the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery in the First World War, and a little bit of nostalgia, I was attracted. I wanted to be in the artillery, so that was my first choice, to be in the artillery. At the time I was in the Midlands up near Birmingham, and my transfer came through, and I went down to the holding unit for gunners. Of course, I had to be trained as a gunner. I already was trained in basic training, rifles and small arms and everything like that, but I didn't know anything about the bigger guns in the regiment. So I was in a basic unit for 3 months roughly, and then they transferred me or posted me to a regiment, which was the 2nd Field Regiment, and was part of the 1st Division. I already was part of the 1st Division anyways, but it was more or less a lateral move. And then the regiment was based on the south coast of England in a place called Littlehampton. And from there, it was in about, I think it was about March or April, they moved us all to Kilmarnock, Scotland, to do some basic training with No. 3 Commandos, because we were going to Sicily, but they didn't tell us where we were going, of course. And then we got aboard ship about the beginning of July, and that was in Gourock, just outside of Glasgow. And then we sailed, and when we were just passing Gibraltar, we knew it was Gibraltar because it was midnight and Spain was all lit up, but Gibraltar, of course, was in darkness. And when they came aboard, that is some of the senior officers somehow came aboard by destroyer or whatever, and they made the announcement, you're headed for the Mediterranean, you're headed for Sicily. And it was the largest armada at that time for an attack. And on the night of the 9th of July, I really remembered, a big storm came up of all things, and we were supposed to get into landing craft and go ashore, of course. And then on the 10th, the Hastings Prince Edward Regiment and the RCRs were the first to attack on the beaches of Sicily. Fortunately, it was not another Dieppe, and the resistance was not as great, of course. It was just light resistance by the Italian army. And I was in on the second wave. I went in on an advance for the artillery to establish an area where the guns would be brought into us. And that was one of my scariest times in all the whole combat. Not so much the action, but getting off the ship and getting into a landing craft, because we went down scrambling nets, and the waves were 6 to 7 feet high going up and down, and the landing craft would disappear from you and then come back up again. You had to prepare yourself to let go of your net to make sure you landed at the proper night, not when it was coming up, but when it was starting to go down. And so everybody learned a few curse words, because you were stepping on other people's fingers that were going down below you, and or else you landed, and there was a few sprained ankles as the landing ship was coming up. Anyways, we went ashore, and And the infantry had cleared up most of what we had expected to do. And we hit a sandbar going in, which was another fortunate thing for us because the water wasn't too deep when we got off. And when they drop the face of the landing craft, all you hear is, get off the beach, get off the beach, get off the beach, because you don't want to be in a standing position. But fortunately, as I said, there was no resistance when we landed. Anyways, it had already been cleared up. And we made our way inland for about a mile to establish our position when the guns came in. Then the big surprise we got was that our guns wouldn't be arriving. They were at the bottom of the Mediterranean. 2 ships had been torpedoed and our guns was on one of them. So that didn't affect the whole regiment because the regiment is 24 guns, but this was only the 4 guns, and it happened to be the area that I was in. So we were dispersed and they transferred us over to make sure we got something to do. So I was more or less put on an outpost with a Bren gun, and of course when you're an outpost it's more or less just security more than anything else because your infantry is at least half a mile or a mile ahead of you and they keep going, you know. But in 19 days we went all the way through Sicily. We'd moved through so fast that not too many things were destroyed. The things that were destroyed was the retreating German army because they set up the explosive areas and that so that to slow us down. And on the 22nd of July, I was slightly wounded, but it was one of the situations was close to an ammunition dump that had already been booby-trapped. And as we were passing by, the dump went up, and actually what goes up must come down. So all the debris coming down picked off a few of us. So I think I was more or less hit by a flying rock than anything else, and just sort of get a little dent in the head. But it wasn't recorded. I was sort of so-called a walking wounded. But Italy was a fast-moving operation. You'd be in operation doing a fast attack up through Italy, and then you come out on rest period, and then you do another situation. And I don't know whether I'm getting too far ahead of you or not, but we landed in Reggio de Calabria on the 3rd of September. This time I went in as reserve, not as an advance, and we went up into the mountains, and the Americans and the British Army attacked further up the coast. They went in a place called Salerno, and the idea was they would go to Salerno and we were Reggio de Calabria and we would come up and meet. But it didn't happen that fast. We were a little delayed going up, and so the group at Salerno had quite a battle on our hands until the Canadians arrived up there. And then from Salerno we moved over to the opposite coast, over to the Adriatic coast, and started moving up the Adriatic coast. And one of my friends that you have the picture in your collection there, the picture was taken in Italy just outside a place called Foggia, and 3 days later he was killed. So altogether I had 3-4 friends that were killed, and not all with me at the time, but in various parts during the war. You know? Then we went up the Adriatic coast, and then the next big action was Orotona, of course, was the biggest battle in Italy that we were in, and that's where you asked about devastation. That was all, they called it at the time the mini Stalingrad, if you've read or anything or heard about Stalingrad. And everything was flattened, and the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Regiment were the big attackers in there. And they developed what was known as mouse-holing. To move from house to house, they blasted a hole in the walls, so rather than go around fighting on the streets, they were going through from home to home to home, you know, and they called that mouse-holing. And the 3rd week after the Battle of Orotona, I sort of got various things happen to me. Malaria caught up with me, which I probably contacted when I was in Sicily, and also I had enteritis. So they sent me down the line, and I went to a hospital in a place called Andria, which is on the Adriatic coast, pretty far south in Italy. And when I was in there, they noticed that I had a lump in my throat, and they said, we'd like to take that out. So jokingly, I said, how much time is this going to buy me? They said, oh, it'll be another 2 weeks. So I said, take it out, I'll stay here. It was lots of comfort to know. So By the time I got back to my regiment, they had moved on, of course, and they were getting ready for the Battle of Cassino, which was a big battle. There had already been 4 battles for Cassino, and this was the 4th one we were in. The Americans had tried it, the British had tried it, the New Zealanders had tried it, but the resistance from Cassino was just terrific. By then, of course, the enemy had been considerably weakened. The Cassino was flattened altogether by bombing and everything. So in the Battle of the Cassino, the Poles came over into the top. The Polish regiments and battalions took Cassino, and the Canadians were at the bottom, and we took a place called Pontecorvo, and we went up that way through. And then that was the next stepping stone to Rome. And we, as Canadians, we've said this over and over again, we could have been the first into Rome, but politics played a big thing on that, and they stopped the Canadian Army at a place called Frosinone, which is just outside of Rome, and General Clark and his American army moved in to be the conquerors of Rome, see. We followed on their, whatever you want to call them, behind them, and we had a look at Rome probably the day after it was taken, but Rome had been declared a free city, and so there was no bombing, which was grateful, because it's a beautiful city. I had later had a leave there, and from Rome we went up the coast again, and after a rest area, and the next big battle we had was a place called Rimini, and that's where I got into a Jeep accident, and I ended up with concussion and a few other little bruises, and I went down the line again for another 3 weeks, and this time they gave me what is called a wound stripe, which, if I may so, is one of the most useless awards that you've ever got, because the American Army, you get a Purple Heart if you're wounded. In the Canadian Army, you got this little gold stripe you put on your tunic. Now, I can't in civil life go around wearing my stripe, so as I say, we called it a useless stripe. In fact, there was an article in the paper just a short time ago that trying to get the Canadian government to introduce something new for the people that are in Afghanistan and that give them some recognition if they're wounded. So I spent 3 weeks after the hospital. This time I went to Perugia, the hospital, and it's just outside of the town of Assisi, where the famous saint comes from, St. Francis of Assisi. And after 3 weeks there, I rejoined my regiment at a place called Forlì. And at Forlì, they gave the Italian partisans a chance to get a little bit of action. So as artillery, we supported the partisans in action. And it was a limited affair, but it let them participate in the war themselves. And then from there, we moved to Ravenna. And now we're progressing. We're already almost finished in the year 1944 in Ravenna. And then from Ravenna, we went off to the Limoni River, where the action for the Canadian Army stopped. And this was to be February in 1945. And then from there, they brought us down to Leghorn, and we're ready to get out of Italy altogether. Now, I don't know if you want me to cover any more on Italy or not.
Oh, I think you're good to keep going here.
From Italy, we were loaded onto landing ship tanks in the whole Canadian 1st Division and the whole Canadian 5th Division, and we were taken to Marseille in southern France, and then we went all the way up through France, like tourists, you might say, convoys, until they brought us to Belgium, and where we regrouped in Belgium, just outside of Antwerp, preparing to join the rest of the Canadian Army for the final attacks on Holland. From what I remember, we went from Boom, just outside of Antwerp, to Emmerich, which crossed the Rhine River, and then we swung around and we came into the town, across the river at Eisel. That was our first action position, in the small towns of Wilp and Twello, just outside of Apeldoorn. And on April the 17th, the RCRs, Royal Canadian Regiment, they took Apeldoorn, and we were in their support. And then from Apeldoorn, we moved to Hoevelaken and Voorthuizen, and we fired our last round for the end of the war in Voorthuizen. And this would probably be about May the 1st, May the 2nd, the war was over for us. But we were just told, no more firing, stand down. And so you just hung around sort of deal. And there was small skirmishes all over the area, of course. And then the word came down that in Holland, the war was over on May the 5th. And of course, the official PE day wasn't until May the 8th. So they moved us from Hoboken over to Rotterdam, and we were in a little town just outside of Rotterdam called Slikkerveer. And our job at that time was to disarm the Germans, and I never seen so many horses before. They were sort of restricted using horses because the Air Force had done a good job on wiping out a lot of their vehicles. And we did the disarmament, and we put them in small concentration camps. And then about a month, maybe a month and a half later, they were all moved, and they were allowed to take their belongings, but they had to go on foot, and they went home to Germany on their own. And as over and over again, I can never say enough about the Dutch people, because then is when I realized what I was in the war was all about. We went into Rotterdam about 4 days after they made that big famous airdrop of food into Rotterdam. And to be quite honest, as a sort of, as I say, so-called as a hard-bitten veteran by that time, anything that was around loose at any time in Italy, we scooped it. It was ours. But when we got to Holland and you saw these stacks and cases of food, they were untouchable. There wasn't even one box looted or anything like that, because we knew the purpose of why the food was there, you know. And so then from Rotterdam, the war was over. They gave us all a leave, and of course a lot of us either went to Paris or to London. I went to London. And then when I came back, the regiment had moved to a place called Boom, just outside of Amsterdam. And we stayed there for about 6 weeks, and then we got on our repatriation to come back to Canada. They moved us from Boom over to Southampton. Southampton got to the on board ship, the New Amsterdam, and we came home. And I left Canada in July 1940, and I came home the 1st of October 1945. I spent 3 Christmases in England and 2 Christmases in Italy. I ended up just as a bombardier, but which is equivalent to a corporal. But after the war, I went back into as an instructor with the Canadian Intelligence Corps, and I moved up until I was a warrant officer 2nd class, which is a sergeant major, you might call it, as an instructor. But I enjoyed it. It was lots of fun.
You've had so many experiences. What were some of the most difficult experiences that you remember? Mm-hmm. That's in Italy, the fighting there?
Ortona, when we moved into the gun position, things were just starting to heat up, and we weren't right in the city of Ortona. As I say, artillery, you're a support. You can be anywhere from a half a mile to maybe 2 miles behind the infantry. But the house we moved into, the man had already died of heart attack. The woman had gone hysterical. She was out of her mind, and the daughter was screaming like crazy too. So you have this going on beside you, and you got a gun sight. You know, you had to move these people somewhere because it was playing on your nerves. And we fired it into the other side of Ortona, that the guns were almost hot, you might say, the amount of rounds that we fired off there. And it wasn't too far from us where Major Triquet from the Royal 22nd Regiment got his Victoria Cross. But I would say, and the conditions, with mud and rain all the time, and you rarely, well, you could take your boots off occasionally. We were lucky, our gun was beside the farmhouse, so we had a place that we sneak into, and take your boots off, but you rarely took your clothes off. And I'll tell you a funny little story. Was when one of the schools I've just been recently talking to, and the children asked me that, just what you asked, but bad experience. I said, well, I would say Ortona because of the mud and the rain and everything. And this little girl is about 6 years old. Did you get wet?
And how would you describe some of your most positive or experiences then, things that were?
Oh, I think going through Holland is it's something I've been back 4 times now already with my wife. On 2 trips, my eldest daughter and her husband come with me. On the last trip, which was in 2005, I had my youngest daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren with me, so the 6 of us went over, and I was fortunate that I was able to get a vehicle for the big parade in Appledore, and my grandchildren were in the parade with me, so that was a great experience. I met the Queen on the last trip, yeah. I was just standing there, and I had taken her picture, and I put my head down, I put my little digital camera in my pocket, and first thing I know, she's standing right in front of me, and she stuck her hand out, and she says, "Thank you for being here, and thank you for coming back, see?" So I said, I was sort of a little flustered because she'd taken my hand, and normally at protocol, royalty is untouchable, you might say, at least you got gloves on or something. So I said, well, it's my pleasure and enjoy it, and I said, if I have my wife with me, Margaret was standing beside me, and I said, but at my age now, I said, I think this will be my last trip. I said, I don't think I'll be back. 2010 is the next one. She says, oh, that's what all you veterans told me the last time you were here 10 years ago. So, but very, very gracious lady. And there was an article written up on it in the Hamilton Spectator and the Beaver. I'll give you a copy of the article if you wish.
And what would you like for young people today to know about the war? Is there anything that you can think of?
I don't know. The wars now, what I keep reading about Afghanistan, is a different type of war altogether. It's not like the action that we had. I mean, these suicide bombers and all these things that it's unusual. But the young people, but I think that they should realize and respect that in both wars, and also the Korean War, all Canadians were volunteers. There was no drafting, or there was conscription near the end of the war, but the conscripts never got into any of the action. And there was a situation that near the end of the war, we were hard up for reinforcements. But as long as they realize there's pride to be a Canadian, I think that's what the biggest thing, and just be proud that you're a Canadian. We're the greatest country in the world.
And after the war, how did you end up in Oakville? When did you get to go?
Well, after the war, I went back to work for the Montreal Star for a limited time, and then I moved over to the White Motor Company, which was an automotive company in 1950 in Montreal. They made white trucks. And then I later, about 22 years later, I transferred to the Mack Truck Company. So all my post-war experience has been in the trucking industries. I was in advertising and public relations. And I'm retired now 20 years, believe it or not. It doesn't seem it, but I'm about 20 years now. But as I said earlier, I was very instrumental in merchandising and selling trucks, but now there's too many on the road.
And so how long have you been in Oakville?
Oh, 50 years.
50 years.
Yeah. My company transferred up here, so it was a natural thing that come or else I'd be unemployed, and that at the age I was, I didn't feel like being unemployed, so I came along, and also I'd reached the junior executive position, so that it was worthwhile coming, because when I traveled anywhere in the country, like at conventions or sales meetings, my wife was permitted to go with me, so that made it a lot easier for moving around. My brother, incidentally, when I left for overseas, he was in short pants and in school, and when I come home, he was in the Army. I'd been away so long. In the post-war years, when I got into public relations, having the close association with all my Army experiences, that it made me feel I'm at ease all the time when I'm with people, and that was the big difference. I noticed when I was in the Army, and also in my younger years, where I lived, it was in sort of a working class district area, so that everybody was basically friendly anyways. So that when I got into the Army with my past experiences, that say when I get reserve Army, not that when I went active, my basic training had all been completed. So no, I was more relaxed, you might say, that's all.
And did you make lasting friendships?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now there's only 3 of us left in the Niagara Peninsula from my regiment. One in Niagara Falls, one in St. Catharines, and I'm here. I keep saying I'm going to be the last one to turn out the lights.
What is your age?
86 then. 86. I'm going in 87th year.
Some of your friends didn't make it back from the action. Did you ever make contact with their families?
Yes. Well, one was like a relative almost, my aunt's brother, Major Campbell. He was with the Hastings Prince Edward Regiment. He was killed at Orotona on Christmas Day, of all things. And his father had been killed in the First World War, pretty close to Christmas too. So that was a close association. I met him. I hadn't known him other than, my aunt, of course, close association. But going into Sicily, I learned that Hastings Prince Edward Regiment, of course, was on the same ship I was. The HMS Derbyshire was a troop ship. So I went up where the officers were on deck, and I was down at the bottom where the ship comes together. But I looked them up, and we had a small chat. And then later on, after the landing, when we got to Orotona, I went down the line to the hospital. So you always identify each other with your, what we call flashes, the badges of your regiment. So I happened to see one young guy walking around and with Hastings Prince Edward, so I happened to say to him, what's happening with Major Campbell? So this was in February. So he says, oh, didn't you hear? He was killed on Christmas Day. And then the other chum, Bill Blair, who I was closely associated with, he was killed just outside of Foggia in Italy. He was a dispatch rider for the colonel, and he had gone up ahead with the colonel in forward observation, and they'd run into some shell fire, and that's when he was killed. I went to see his parents in Montreal, and he was the only son also, and that was a little difficult when I went to see him. The other 2 were just friends through association in the regiment. One was a fellow by the name of Graham, and the other was a fellow was named Lombard, Bob Lombard. He was with the Seaforths. He got killed in Agira in Sicily in the infantry. But he was another one. The other 2, Graham and Lombard, were with me in the medical corps, and it was a situation they got out. When they got into England, they were allowed to transfer out. One chose the Royal Montreal Regiment, and Lombard chose the Seaforths. And their choosing wasn't as good as mine, unfortunately.
Okay, I think that's fine. Yep.
I think so.
A couple little humorous things I may mention to you is when I went my leave to Rome, when I got there, I was with one of my buddies. We were walking around, and there's a street artist, and they just doing caricatures, what have you. So he flagged me down. He said, "I'd like to paint your picture." So I said, "Oh, how long is it going to take?" So he says, "Oh, maybe an hour." I said, "That's too long for me. I don't have that time." He says, "Leave it with me." He said, "Let me sketch your face." And so he said, well, he sketched my face, and so he said, "What regiment are you with?" So, not knowing any difference, you're not supposed to reveal all these things, but I said I was with artillery. And he says, "Okay, come back in an hour." So when I came back in an hour, he had a caricature of me being shot out of a gun. My face, you can see him, you see my uniform, and I'm landing in a swamp, and there's a young nude lady standing there, just the upper part of her body showing. In fact, I have a picture, I can show you a copy of it. The other humorous thing is, while I was in Rome, and when you go into a hair salon, you can have anything you want. You get massage and baths, the hot steams and everything like that. And I had just finished growing a beautiful walrus mustache. Nothing like Lanny McDonald, a hockey player, but at my age it was a good one. So having had a few vinos, I said to the barber, I said, "Give me the works." And then I fell asleep in a chair. And when I woke up, I had a little French mustache. And I was being solid brown color with my tan out of Sicily, and this had this big white patch now where my mustache used to be. So there's a little bit of humor as you went along too, But in Holland, beautiful friendships and that. And the first time we went over, my wife and I, we took just a a tour. We took London, we took England, and it included France and then Holland. But the last 3 trips we got involved in this Thank You Canada group, and you go to a host family, and you pay all your own expenses as far as travel, but the host take care of it when you arrive there, and also they get you to where you want to go, to the cemeteries or to the parades and that. So the people that we have stayed with, some of them have since come over here now, and we've had 2, 3, there's been 3 couples now that have been over and stayed with us, or my daughters, and of course we've given them the grand tour, taken them around, and that's, one of them is very, very adventurous. They rented a car and they went as far as Cape Breton on their own, and then came back, and they've seen things that I've never even seen in Canada, in the backcountry, you know, because they gave us a DVD that they'd taken themselves, you know. No, I don't think I'll see 2010, but anyways, I will see 2010, but I don't think in Holland. I don't foresee the idea of being pushed around over there, that's for sure. Although I'm reasonably healthy. Just a couple of bum knees and.
Mm-hmm. No, I was wondering about wartime. You know, the people in Holland were occupied for years, and did you were just concentrating on the job to be done to liberate the country?
Fabulous people.
Yeah.
The Apeldoorn was the first big action that we had, like the 1st Division, and you know, I still vividly see it, the crying, the laughing, the singing, and everything after we went through the town. But then when we went into Rotterdam, we were into Rotterdam, where just over as far as Holland was concerned, and as I said earlier, we were relieving the Germans now. They pulled me right out of my vehicle, actually. Just literally pulled me right out, hugging and kissing and everything like that. We couldn't move. The crowds were so deep. So one young lady came up to the average age, I suppose, at that time, and she says, "Can we do something for you?" So I said, "Look, I haven't washed, shaved," I said, "for a couple of days. Can you give me some hot water?" So she went into the house, and she brought out a kettle. So I took off my steel helmet, which we rarely wore, but it just happened, and if you put it down somewhere, somebody would have lifted it on you, sort of deal. And I took out the inner casing, and I put the steel helmet upside down on the fender of the truck. She poured the water into it. I took off my jacket and took off my shirt, got out my shaving kit, got the water and all, and I set up a little steel mirror on the side so I could see what I was doing. And I said, I put this on, and I said, I look in the steel mirror, and I look around me. There's about 20 people, my audience, watching me get cleaned up, you know, which was very amusing. But we tried to do as much as we could too with what we had. As you know, we got gifts of cigarettes and chocolates and all that from home and that, and cigarettes were at a premium. They were going for 40 cents a piece, believe it or not, in some areas. So you were always handing those things out. And chocolate, you just kept giving them away as much as you could to the kids, you know, just wonderful people. But I used to have one favorite little bar that I went to in Rotterdam, because you had lots of free time, and they had a little combo in there, a 3-piece combo, and they asked me what song that I liked. I was never much of a musically inclined, so I said, "Oh, Deep Purple." So after that, every night that I went in, the band had stopped what they were doing, and they played Deep Purple. I got to know the song after a while, and of course I'd throw them a package of cigarettes, you know, just to pay off. Fabulous people.